The contract begins. Emma Whitmore stood on the edge of a new life, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the marriage contract on the polished glass coffee table. The reality of what she had just signed hit her with a wave of cold disbelief. She had just sold her soul to a man she barely knew, a wealthy business tycoon named Julian Ashford. Only 23 years old, Emma had agreed to this arrangement to save her father from the mounting debts that had threatened to drown their family. Julian Ashford was everything she wasn't: powerful, rich, and completely indifferent to her world. She thought back to the moments leading up to this decision. Her father's hospital bills piling up, the debt from his failed restaurant, and the enormous sum Julian had promised her. It was her only choice. The man was offering her a way out, a way to save her family, and in return she had to become his wife, on paper only. The reality was that she would live in his lavish penthouse and play the part of his wife, attending social events and maintaining appearances, but that would be the extent of their connection. Julian had told her it was simple, a contract. There were no strings attached, no expectations. His lawyer would provide her with a credit card for expenses, and she would go through the motions. She was to remain a shadow in his life, a figure to be seen but never truly known. The penthouse was as grand as it was lonely. Emma spent the first few months of the arrangement feeling like a stranger in a strange land. Julian was hardly ever home, his work life consumed him, and when he did return, it was after long hours of power meetings. He barely acknowledged her existence beyond the bare minimum required by their contract. Emma, for her part, kept to herself. She continued working at a small bookstore in Brooklyn, not because she needed the money, but because she wanted something real in her life. The bookstore was her anchor, a place where she could still feel like herself in a world that had lost all meaning. The weeks went by and Emma fell into a routine. She would attend the high society parties with Julian, acting as his arm candy. They would be photographed, the press would make remarks about their perfect marriage, and then they would retreat back to their separate worlds. Julian was cold, distant, and controlling in a way she could never fully understand. But there was something beneath the surface, something broken in Julian, something he tried so hard to hide. Emma could see it even though he went to great lengths to shut her out. There were moments, fleeting and rare, when his eyes would betray him. She had seen it the first time they met, a deep pain behind his icy exterior. It wasn't until months later, after yet another one of their impersonal dinner parties, that she would catch a glimpse of the real Julian Ashford. As they stood together in the middle of one such event, Emma overheard a conversation between Julian and a business associate, his words dripping with disdain. "My wife," the associate had said, eyeing Emma like a prize, "where did you find such a treasure?" The words stung. Emma was more than a trophy on Julian's arm, but he made no effort to correct the assumption. That was when she realized that, for all his wealth and status, Julian had no real understanding of what it meant to connect with someone. He was an island, untouchable and unreachable, and Emma was just another piece in his life that served to maintain his image. Later that night, Emma sat in the silence of their empty penthouse, her heart heavy with the weight of it all. She had never expected love, but she had hoped for something more than this. She wanted to feel like she mattered, like her presence meant something to Julian beyond the contract they had signed. But the distance between them felt insurmountable, and as the months went by, it became harder to keep her emotions at bay. Julian's coldness cut deep, but she kept her distance as best as she could. The truth was, she didn't know how much longer she could pretend that everything was fine. Something was missing and she couldn't keep lying to herself. This wasn't a marriage, not in any real sense. She was just a placeholder, a woman who lived in the background of a man's life. A change in the air. The first few months had passed in a blur of luxury and isolation, but Emma felt a slow shift inside her. She was beginning to notice things about Julian, things she hadn't before. Despite his icy demeanor, he wasn't as impervious as he appeared. There were small moments when his guard slipped. The first time she saw him without his usual polished mask was when he was reading through some paperwork late one night, alone in his office. It was the first time she had seen him in such a vulnerable light. No board meetings, no power suits, no commanding presence. Just Julian looking tired and human. Emma couldn't help but wonder if there was more to him than the emotionally distant man she had been forced to live with. For all of his power and wealth, he seemed to carry a weight, a burden that made him more fragile than anyone could ever imagine. His perfection was a facade, and behind it was a loneliness that cut deeper than anything Emma had ever known. It was in moments like this that Emma found herself wondering if she could break through that wall. But her thoughts were always fleeting. She reminded herself constantly of the reasons she was here: her family's debts, her father's medical bills, the contract that had bound her to this life. But the longer she lived in his world, the more she realized that there was a part of her that longed for something real. Her longing for connection had grown stronger, and despite her best efforts to remain detached, Emma began to feel the cracks in her heart. The loneliness, the empty social events, the hollow smiles at dinner parties, it all felt like a cruel joke. She was a trophy in a gilded cage, and for all the riches around her, she had never felt more alone. The penthouse was enormous, and yet it felt like a tomb. Julian's absence, though constant, didn't make the space feel empty. It made it suffocating. The silence was louder than any noise. One evening, as the rain battered against the windows, Emma wandered into the kitchen to find Mrs. Chin, the housekeeper, preparing dinner. There was something calming about the older woman's steady presence. She was always kind, always watching out for Emma. As she prepared the meal, Mrs. Chin spoke in gentle tones, offering Emma advice on simple things. How to make the coffee just right, where the best books could be found in the city, and sometimes, offering quiet wisdom on how to live a life with grace despite its challenges. She had learned quickly that Emma was different from the other women who had come through the Ashford estate. Emma wasn't interested in the glamour or the fame, and Mrs. Chin admired that. But the housekeeper's words also carried an undertone of concern, as if she feared Emma was in danger of losing herself in this strange life she had been thrust into. "Mr. Ashford is a man of business, Emma," Mrs. Chin said one evening, handing her a plate of hot soup. "He built his empire by keeping his emotions locked away. Don't let him fool you. It's not the money or the power that keeps him awake at night, it's the loneliness he refuses to acknowledge. I've worked for the Ashford family for many years. I've seen the man he used to be before he became this." She trailed off, eyes full of knowing sadness. "And I've seen how much he needs someone to care." Emma didn't know what to say to that. She had her own thoughts, her own growing feelings, but she wasn't ready to acknowledge them yet. Mrs. Chen's words stayed with her, echoing in her mind as she spent more evenings alone in the penthouse, watching the city lights flicker below her. Emma tried to focus on her work at the bookstore, but the thoughts of Julian crept into her mind constantly. It wasn't until one fateful evening when she returned from a late shift at the bookstore that she saw something that would change everything. The penthouse was dark when she entered, but as she stepped inside, she was surprised to hear voices coming from the study. She knew Julian had returned, which in itself wasn't unusual, but there was something different about tonight. As she walked closer, she heard him speaking in an unusually tense voice. "I told you, Richard, the deal is off. I won't do business with someone who exploits their workers. You can take your proposal and—" Julian's voice cut off abruptly as the door opened, and he saw her standing there, drenched from the rain. The moment his eyes met hers, his entire posture changed. The anger, the coldness, the commanding aura all disappeared in an instant, replaced by something softer, something more human. "Emma," he said, his voice shaking just slightly. "You're soaked. What happened?" She hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to respond. She was tired, wet, and cold, but it was more than that. She was unsettled by what she had just overheard. Julian, the man who seemed impervious to emotion, was unraveling right in front of her. His anger had been real, but so was his vulnerability. "I'm fine," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. She wanted to walk away, to retreat to the safety of her own space. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the glimpse of a side of Julian she had never seen before. Maybe it was the vulnerability in his eyes that drew her in. "I just need to change." He didn't argue. Instead, he took a step forward, his usual arrogance gone. "Let me help you," he offered, his voice unexpectedly gentle. "You're freezing." Emma shook her head softly, not wanting to give in to his concern. She had lived most of her life without anyone to care for her. She didn't want to rely on Julian, of all people. But as she moved to step past him, her vision blurred and suddenly her knees buckled. Before she could fall, Julian was there, catching her in his arms, his grip firm but gentle. For the first time, Emma felt something real in his touch, something more than the cold indifference that had marked their interactions. He held her as if she was the most fragile thing in the world. "Emma, what's going on?" "You're shaking," Julian said, his voice urgent, stripped of its usual cool tone. "I'm just tired," Emma whispered, feeling her body relax into his arms despite herself. The exhaustion from the day, the stress of maintaining this facade, it all came crashing down in that moment. She was more than just a contract to him. She realized that now. Without another word, Julian lifted her and carried her toward the bathroom. His touch was careful, considerate, and for the first time in their strange marriage, Emma allowed herself to feel a small flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this contract wasn't as final as she had once believed. Cracks in the facade. The next morning, Emma woke to an unexpected silence. The heavy rain from the previous night had stopped, leaving behind the scent of fresh air and a sense of calm in the penthouse. But this calm felt different. There was an odd tension between her and Julian, one that hadn't been there before. She could feel it in the air, as though the walls that had separated them were beginning to crumble, brick by brick. Julian was already awake when Emma entered the kitchen. He was sitting at the table, his laptop open, his face buried in the screen as usual. But something was different. His usual stern expression was softer, almost weary, as if the weight of his empire had suddenly become too much to bear. "Morning," Emma said quietly, taking a step toward the counter to pour herself a cup of coffee. She tried to ignore the strange flutter in her chest as she glanced at him. "Morning," Julian replied without looking up. There was a pause, a long one, before he spoke again. I didn't mean to make you feel uncomfortable last night. When I caught you." Emma stiffened, surprised by his sudden acknowledgement. She had expected him to brush it off, to pretend it never happened, but instead, he was opening a door she hadn't thought he would. She glanced at him, her eyes searching for any hint of insincerity, but there was none. "You didn't make me feel uncomfortable," she said softly, her voice betraying her uncertainty. "I was just exhausted." Julian nodded slowly, his gaze finally meeting hers. "It's not just that though, is it? You've been carrying everything on your own, haven't you?" Emma swallowed hard, her throat tightening. She didn't know how to answer him. She had been carrying the weight of this arrangement, her family's debts, and her own loneliness for so long. Julian didn't understand that. He couldn't. How could he? He had everything. Money, power, status, things she could never dream of. "Don't worry about it," she said, more to herself than to him. "I'm fine." But Julian was already shaking his head. "No, you're not. I've seen the way you look at me, the way you keep everything inside. I know I haven't made this easy for you, Emma. I haven't been a good husband." The word hung in the air like a heavy stone. Emma froze, unsure of what to say. Husband. The word felt foreign, hollow, even though they had both signed that piece of paper months ago. But there was something about the way Julian said it now, with such unexpected vulnerability, that made her heart beat a little faster. "Julian, this wasn't ever supposed to be about us being a real couple," she whispered, trying to make sense of the turmoil inside her. "It was just a contract. We're not a family." His expression darkened at her words, and for a moment, Emma saw the man behind the cold billionaire mask. He wasn't the arrogant, untouchable man he had appeared to be at first. He was someone broken, someone who had built a fortress around himself to protect whatever remained of his heart. "You're right," he said, his voice quiet but heavy with emotion. "But somewhere along the way I started wishing it was more. I've been telling myself this was just business, but I've been lying to myself. This isn't just a contract, Emma." Emma's heart skipped a beat as she processed his words. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Julian was opening up to her in a way she never thought possible. He was letting her see a side of him he had carefully kept hidden, and it terrified her. She had spent so much time trying to keep her distance, trying to protect her heart, but now, faced with Julian's raw honesty, she didn't know what to do. "I don't know what to say," she confessed softly, her voice shaking. "This was never supposed to be anything more than a way for me to help my family. I never expected to feel anything." Julian stood up from the table, walking toward her with a slow, deliberate pace. Emma's breath hitched as he came closer. His eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her heart race. "You're more than just a contract, Emma," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're everything I didn't know I needed. And now I don't know how to fix this mess we've created." His words struck her like a thunderclap. For the first time since they'd met, Emma saw him, truly saw him, as more than the wealthy businessman who had hired her to be his wife. She saw the man who had been forced to build walls around his heart, to protect himself from the pain of loss, of betrayal, of being seen as a tool for his family's ambitions. And in that moment, Emma realized that she had been doing the same thing. She had built walls too, walls that kept her from feeling anything, from letting herself care. She had come into this arrangement expecting nothing, but somewhere along the way she had started to care about Julian, about the man he was underneath the cold exterior. "Maybe we both need to tear down these walls," Emma said softly, her voice full of hope and fear. "Maybe we need to stop pretending that this is just a contract, because it's not. Not anymore." Julian's eyes softened, his jaw tightening as if he was holding back a flood of emotions. "I don't know how to do that," he confessed. "But I want to try. I want to make this right." Emma reached out, placing her hand over his. The The touch was simple, but it meant everything. She had no idea what the future held, but for the first time she felt like there was a chance. A chance for something real, something more than just an arrangement between two strangers. As the morning sunlight poured through the windows, the two of them stood in that quiet kitchen, their hands intertwined as if they were taking the first steps toward something they both needed: connection. The tipping point. The next few days felt different, strangely lighter, as if something had shifted in the air between them. Emma could sense it, though neither of them had spoken directly about what had happened that morning in the kitchen. Julian had been quieter, more introspective, his usual commanding presence replaced by a softer, more contemplative version of himself. She could see the weight of his thoughts in his eyes whenever he looked at her. It was as though for the first time in months he was truly seeing her, not as a contract wife, not as a decoration for his life, but as a person, a real person with her own desires, struggles, and heartaches. Emma found herself drawn to him in a way that she hadn't anticipated. She was still terrified of what this newfound connection might mean for both of them. She had spent so long building walls around her heart, refusing to let herself care, and now those walls were crumbling brick by brick. The vulnerability she had always avoided was suddenly right in front of her, and she didn't know how to handle it. One evening, after another grueling day at the bookstore, Emma returned to the penthouse, her body tired, her mind exhausted from the emotional toll of the past few days. She expected the usual silence when she walked in, but this time, something was different. The lights were on, and she could hear the faint sound of music coming from the living room. Julian was there, his back turned to her as he stood in front of the fireplace, a glass of whiskey in his hand. When he turned and saw her standing there, a look of surprise flashed across his face, followed quickly by something else: relief. "Emma," he said softly, his voice warm. "I thought you might be working late again." She nodded, crossing the room slowly. "I was. Inventory, stock check, you know how it is." Julian studied her for a long moment, his gaze lingering on her face. "I'm glad you're home," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He gestured toward the couch. "I ordered dinner. I thought we could eat together." Emma hesitated for a moment. The last few weeks had been full of awkwardness and unspoken tension, but there was something about Julian's invitation that felt different. For the first time she felt like he was reaching out, not out of obligation, but because he genuinely wanted to spend time with her. He wasn't trying to keep her at arm's length anymore. He was opening up, and so, for the first time in a long while, Emma allowed herself to take that step forward. As they sat down to eat, the conversation flowed more easily than it had in the past. Julian asked about her day, about the bookstore, about her plans for the future. He listened intently, his attention fully on her for the first time in ages. Emma found herself talking about things she had never shared with him before: the struggles at the bookstore, the long hours, the pressure of keeping up appearances in their contract marriage. Julian didn't interrupt or dismiss her feelings. Instead, he looked at her with empathy, as if he understood what it felt like to be trapped in a life you hadn't chosen for yourself. For a brief moment, it was as if they were just two people. No contracts, no obligations, just two souls connecting over a simple dinner. But the moment didn't last. As the night wore on, the weight of their unspoken emotions began to settle back in. Julian's eyes grew distant, his mind obviously returning to the realities of his world. The business deals, the responsibilities, the expectations. Emma could see the familiar mask beginning to fall back into place. It wasn't until they were clearing the table that Julian spoke again, his voice low and serious. "Emma, I need to tell you something." Emma froze, her heart racing as she turned toward him. "What is it?" He looked conflicted, as if he were struggling to find the right words. "I've been thinking a lot about everything. About us." He paused, his jaw tight. "I know this arrangement was supposed to be temporary, but I can't keep pretending that it's not affecting me. I've never felt anything like this before." Emma felt a sharp pang in her chest. The words she had been afraid of hearing were finally coming to the surface. She had felt it too, this connection, but she hadn't wanted to admit it, hadn't wanted to acknowledge that she was starting to care for him in a way she hadn't planned. "I'm not the same man you met 6 months ago," Julian continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't expect this to happen, and I'm not sure I even know what to do with it. But I want you to know that I'm not just using you anymore. I'm not just keeping you here for appearances. He stopped himself, looking away as though he couldn't bear to finish the sentence. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. "Julian, I don't know what you're trying to say," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "You're saying all the right things, but I'm scared. I'm scared because this isn't just a contract anymore. This feels real." And I don't know if I can trust that. He stepped closer, his hand gently reaching out to touch hers. I know, he said softly. I'm scared too. For a long moment, they stood there in the dimly lit kitchen, their hands intertwined, neither of them knowing what to say next. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable, but it wasn't easy either. It was filled with all the emotions they had both been trying to bury: fear, uncertainty, and a deep, undeniable longing. Finally, Julian spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. I don't want you to leave. I don't want this to be over. Not like this. Emma's breath hitched in her throat. But it's a contract, Julian. It's just a piece of paper. That's all it ever was, he agreed. But I don't want it to be any more. Not if you don't want it to be. Tears filled Emma's eyes and she pulled her hand away from his, wrapping her arms around herself. I didn't expect to fall for you, she said, her voice cracking. I didn't expect any of this. But now, I'm not sure what happens next. What do we do now? Julian stepped back, his hands running through his hair in frustration. I don't have all the answers, he admitted. But I want to figure it out. With you. Emma took a shaky breath, her heart torn between the fear of the unknown and the hope that maybe, just maybe, this could turn into something more than a contract. She had never expected to find anything real in this marriage, but now, standing in front of Julian, she wasn't so sure. The truth revealed. The days following that night in the kitchen were filled with uncertainty, but also a glimmer of hope. Emma and Julian had shifted into a new phase of their strange marriage. One where they no longer just shared a space or a contract but something deeper. The distance between them had slowly evaporated, and in its place was a tentative connection, one that neither of them fully understood, but both were willing to explore. Emma's heart was a battleground. She wanted to believe in the change, wanted to believe that Julian had opened up to her not because of obligation, but because he truly cared. Yet the old fears still clung to her like a shadow. What if it was all just another act? What if the walls Julian had let down were only temporary, a fleeting moment of vulnerability that would retreat back into the fortress of his emotional armor? But as the days passed, Emma began to see things she hadn't noticed before. Julian had changed and so had she. They were no longer just playing roles in each other's lives. They were beginning to trust each other. For the first time in months, Julian didn't see her as just a woman in a contract, and Emma didn't see him as a billionaire with a broken heart. They were two people, navigating their own fears and desires, trying to figure out what it meant to care. It was one afternoon a week later when everything changed. Emma was sitting at the kitchen table, leafing through a book, when Julian entered the room. There was something in his eyes, something different, something urgent. He stood there for a moment, just watching her, his expression unreadable. Emma, he said, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. We need to talk. Her heart skipped. The words she had feared hearing again, words she knew would come but never knew when, were now here. She put the book down, sitting up straighter, her mind racing. Was he ending it? Was this just another moment of cold reality crashing down? I don't want to lose you, Julian continued, his eyes intense, locking onto hers. I never should have kept you in the dark. I never should have pretended like this arrangement wasn't affecting me. But the truth is, I didn't know how to deal with it. I didn't know how to deal with you. Emma swallowed hard. What are you saying, Julian? He stepped closer, running a hand through his hair, the frustration clear in his movements. I've been fighting myself for months. The truth is, I can't keep pretending that this is just a contract. You've become more to me than I ever thought possible. More than I ever allowed myself to admit. Her pulse quickened. But I'm still your contract wife, she said, trying to steady her voice. We agreed on this. This was never meant to be real. He shook his head, frustration and confusion mixing in his features. That was the lie I told myself, he said firmly. You're not just a contract. You never were. But I was too afraid to admit it. To admit that I'm falling for you, Emma. The words hung in the air between them, and Emma felt like the ground beneath her feet had shifted. Julian Ashford, the man who had built walls taller than anything she had ever known, was standing before her, confessing something she never thought she'd hear. I've spent my whole life avoiding this, he continued, his voice raw. Avoiding feelings. Avoiding connection. But with you it's different. I can't keep pretending. I don't want to. And I know it's messy and I know it's complicated, but I can't walk away from this anymore. Emma's chest tightened, her emotions swirling in a storm. She had thought she had everything figured out, that this would be a brief, temporary arrangement that would end once her family was taken care of. But somewhere along the way she had started to care. She had started to fall for Julian too, despite the contract, despite the cold distance, despite everything. "I don't know how to do this, Julian," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to trust this. You've been so closed off for so long. How do I know this isn't just a phase?" Julian stepped forward, his expression softening as he gently cupped her face in his hands. "Because I'm here, Emma. I'm not running anymore. I'm not hiding. I'm giving you all of me, every part of me, even the broken parts. And I know I don't deserve it, but I'm asking you to take a chance on me. Take a chance on us." Tears welled up in Emma's eyes as she stared up at him. There was so much fear, so much doubt, but there was also a deep yearning for the possibility of something real. She had been so afraid of opening her heart, afraid of letting herself care. But now, looking at Julian, she realized that she couldn't keep living in fear of what might happen. She had to take the risk just like he was doing. "I've been scared too," Emma confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't keep running either. I want this, Julian. I want us to be real." A smile tugged at the corners of Julian's lips as he pulled her into his arms. She let herself fall into his embrace, allowing the weight of everything to fall away. The contract, the fear, the uncertainty, it all melted in that moment. They didn't need to have all the answers. They didn't need to know what the future held. What mattered was that they had chosen to take this step together. For the first time, Emma allowed herself to fully trust Julian. And for the first time, Julian opened himself up to her in a way that felt honest, vulnerable, and real. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, the world outside seemed to fade. There were no more contracts, no more pretending. Just two people ready to build something new, something beautiful from the ashes of their past.